If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
3 weeks before the low-level strike at Ploiești, Captain John Bing Baker and his co-pilot, Lieutenant John Jerstad, stood on the baking Libyan airfield of Benghazi, studying the plans for an operation that many quietly believed was a one-way mission. Operation Tidal Wave called for 178 B-24 Liberators to fly at treetop height for over 1,000 miles, threading through Axis-controlled territory to destroy Hitler's most valuable source of aviation fuel. For Baker, a veteran pilot with a reputation for calm precision, the stakes were clear. The oil refineries at Ploiești were the industrial heart of the Nazi war machine, protected by one of the densest anti-aircraft networks in Europe. The maps on the briefing table looked less like charts and more like death warrants. Rings of flak batteries, fighter bases, emergency balloon fields, and smoke generators designed to blind incoming bombers. Every squadron commander present knew the numbers. Some intelligence officers predicted losses approaching 50%. But Baker didn't flinch. He had flown dangerous missions before. He had seen men break, and he had learned that fear could be managed only through discipline, preparation, and absolute trust in one's crew. Inside the tented operations hut, the atmosphere crackled with tension as the crews rehearsed their assignments. Pilots traced the flight path with gloved fingers, bombardiers memorized refinery layouts, and gunners practiced blind spot angles in the shimmering desert heat. Jerstad, tall, serious, and fiercely committed, took personal responsibility for drilling the crew of Hell's Wench until every action became instinct. They knew their B-24 wouldn't survive a prolonged fight. Its survival depended on speed, precision, and flying so low that the slipstream of the wings might cut the tops off the Romanian crops. In the evenings, Baker walked the flight line, touching the blistered aluminum skin of their bomber, making mental notes of every rattle and vibration. Mechanics worked without sleep, reinforcing fuel lines, tuning engines, and fitting the aircraft with extra fire extinguishers, even though many doubted any extinguisher would matter at Ploiești's predicted flame temperatures. Letters home were written, but not mailed. The men stopped talking about after the mission. And yet, amid that quiet fatalism, Baker and Jerstad forged something rare, the unspoken understanding that regardless of the odds, they would not turn back. Their job was not to survive. Their job was to lead. And on the morning of August 1st, 1943, when the bombers roared to life under the rising desert sun, every man in the crew of Hell's Wench knew he was stepping into the most dangerous raid the Allies had attempted in the entire war. The formation thundered northward over the Mediterranean, the desert fading behind them as the Liberators settled into their long, punishing approach toward the Balkans. For the first 90 minutes, everything unfolded according to plan. Tight intervals, clean radio silence, and engines humming in perfect synchronization. But the deeper they flew into hostile airspace, the more fragile that illusion of control became. Turbulence slammed the bombers as they crossed the rugged Pindus Mountains, forcing Baker to fight the controls to keep Hell's Wench steady at the mandated low altitude. Ahead, the lead elements began drifting off course,
their navigation disrupted by haze and unexpected winds sweeping in from the Black Sea. Baker, squinting through the cockpit glass, instantly sensed something was wrong. The terrain didn't match the maps, the timing felt off, and the staggered formation was starting to stretch into ragged clusters. Jerstad crawled between the cockpit and the nose compartment, checking and rechecking their own figures, while the navigator, Lieutenant Russell Belt, worked feverishly over charts that were rapidly becoming useless. Then came the real blow. An abrupt jolt shook the aircraft as Belt's interphone line went dead. Minutes later, a grim-faced waist gunner relayed what Baker couldn't bear to ask. Belt had collapsed. Whether from heat stroke, oxygen deprivation, or a sudden medical failure, no one knew. But what they did know was far worse. Without their navigator, their odds of reaching Ploiești on target dropped from slim to nearly impossible. With the clock ticking and the formation fracturing, Baker and Jerstad were forced to improvise in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. Jerstad knelt over Belt's still form, checking for signs of life. But the man who had studied every bend of the Danube and memorized every Romanian road network was gone. They wrapped him gently in a parachute liner and braced him in place, the heart of their guidance suddenly silent. The responsibility now fell entirely on Baker and Jerstad, who pored over Belt's half-finished calculations and the quickly shifting landscape below. The Liberators around them struggled to maintain cohesion, some veering left, some veering right, trying desperately to realign with the intended course. Ahead, the lead group made a catastrophic turn toward Bucharest rather than Ploiești, a fatal mistake that would feed dozens of bombers directly into the teeth of the Axis defenses. Baker recognized the error instantly, his gut twisting as he realized the mission's precision had shattered before the first bomb was even dropped. Yet he refused to break formation or abandon the plan. Shouting corrections over the interphone, he pushed Hell's Wench lower, skimming rooftops and tree lines, hoping terrain features would help him pick out the approach route their navigator had painstakingly charted. It was no longer about perfect timing or flawless execution. It was about salvaging whatever fragments of the mission they could. The most dangerous raid of the war had barely begun, and already the men of Hell's Wench were flying blind into a storm of fire.
The Liberators plunged deeper into Romania, the terrain rising and falling beneath them in a blur of fields, orchards, and scattered villages. Smoke began to drift across the horizon, thin at first, then growing thicker, rolling like a dark tide that marked the proximity of Ploiești's vast oil fields. But something wasn't right. The lead formation, commanded by Colonel Keith Compton and General Uzel Ent, had drifted far off the planned attack corridor. Instead of approaching from the northwest, where the low-level run would thread the bombers between key landmarks, they were veering sharply toward Bucharest, straight into heavily fortified zones and away from the intended refinery targets. From the cockpit of Hell's Wench, Baker watched the mistake unfold with rising dread. He had studied Belt's maps with obsessive focus during training. He knew every river bend, every factory silhouette, and what he saw ahead was wrong, dead wrong. Following the lead ship now meant flying into a nightmare kill box designed by the Germans to shred unwary intruders. Jerstad leaned forward, gripping the back of Baker's seat, both men staring in disbelief as the lead formation committed fully to the incorrect turn. The interphone crackled with confusion from the crew. "Are we off target? Why are we heading east?" But Baker said nothing. He was too busy calculating, too busy deciding whether to follow orders
or survive. The moment stretched into something electric, suffocating, as Hell's Wench roared barely 50 feet above the countryside. Columns of dust trailed behind the formation, kicked up by the slipstream of dozens of bombers scraping the earth at suicidal speed. Baker knew the mission plan demanded absolute discipline, no deviations, no improvisation. Yet sticking with the lead would doom them. Ploiești's perimeter defenses had been constructed precisely where the lead ships were now headed, and even from miles away, Baker could already see the first flashes of anti-aircraft batteries coming alive, like angered wasp nests. Gerstad's voice cut through the cockpit. "John, they're wrong. We're off course." Baker didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked between the erroneous path and the faint but unmistakable refinery markers to the northwest, the route Belt had meticulously plotted before his death. The choice was excruciating. Disobey the lead and potentially rupture the formation, or follow them into chaos and watch the mission collapse. Then he saw something that erased all hesitation. Ahead, the air around Compton's formation erupted in black puffs of flak, thick and violent, rising in layers so dense they looked like walls. Baker clenched his jaw. He shoved the throttles forward and banked Hell's Wench hard to the right. "Hang on, we're taking the right course." The crew responded instantly, not questioning, not hesitating, simply trusting the men who refused to let their navigator die for nothing. With that single, defiant turn, Baker sealed the fate of their bomber and carved his name into the legend of the most disastrous, most heroic raid of the war.
The moment Hell's Wench pivoted back toward the correct attack corridor, it was as if Baker had opened a door straight into a man-made hell. The city of Ploiești no longer looked like a target. It looked alive, like a massive, sprawling beast awakening under the roar of approaching engines. Smokestacks belched black columns skyward, and through the haze Baker saw them, the first clusters of barrage balloons, hundreds of them, rising on steel cables like a floating minefield. They weren't scattered randomly, they formed layers, low, medium, high, designed specifically to trap low-flying bombers. Each cable was thick enough to tear a wing clean off, and the Romanians had anchored them in tight lines around the refineries. Baker dipped lower, praying the Liberators' wingtips wouldn't snag a cable in the haze. Then the flak started, first in probing flashes, then in full synchronized barrages. The ground erupted in sheets of black explosions, timed perfectly to the altitude the Americans were forced to fly. The air became gritty with smoke, hot metal, and burning chemicals. Hell's Wench shook like a living thing as shrapnel clattered against her skin, ripping small holes through the fuselage. Through the top turret, the gunners shouted warnings, balloon cables ahead, flak at 2 o'clock, but there was no way around it. Baker had to thread his bomber into the narrow kill lane Belt had identified months earlier, flying low enough to avoid cables, but high enough to prevent the plane from smashing into ground structures. It felt like threading a 30-ton needle through a wall of knives. As they crossed the refinery perimeter, the defenses intensified into a level of violence no training film had prepared them for. German and Romanian gunners had been waiting, alerted minutes earlier by the misdirected lead formation that had blundered straight into the decoy zone. Now the enemy shifted their full fury toward the incoming bombers on the correct path. Towers fitted with quadruple 20mm cannons opened up, sweeping the sky with blazing streams that looked like continuous, burning spears. Oil tanks were already burning from earlier hits, throwing waves of heat into the air so strong that Baker could feel them through the cockpit glass. The turbulence wasn't just rough, it was violent, chaotic, as if the air itself were tearing apart. At 50 feet altitude, the Liberators were flying through a world where everything was fire, smoke, steel, or death. A massive balloon cable appeared out of the haze for just a second, far too close. Baker yanked the control wheel, scraping past it by what felt like inches. Behind him, another B-24 wasn't as lucky. The crew watched in horror as the wing caught a cable, the bomber cartwheeling into the refinery in an eruption of flame. But Baker didn't, and couldn't, look away from the path ahead. His knuckles were bloodless on the controls, sweat dripping into his eyes. The mission might already be doomed, but that didn't change a single thing about what he had to do. Hell's Wench would go in. They would hit their target. And whatever waited inside that furnace of flak and steel, they would face it head on.
When Hell's Wench burst through the final row of barrage balloons, Baker finally saw the target zone with full clarity and understood instantly why Ploiești was considered the deadliest flak concentration in the world. The refinery complex beneath them was a living inferno, pipes roaring with pressure, towers spitting fire, smokestacks belching choking clouds that turned daylight into a sickly yellow dusk. But before Baker could even line up the bombing run, a sudden metallic clang hit the fuselage, followed by a tearing, grinding shriek that vibrated through the entire airframe. A 20mm shell had struck the right wing root, detonating against the fuel line. Flames erupted instantly, whipping across the wing like a living creature, bright orange against the black sky. The smell of burning aviation fuel flooded the cockpit. Baker didn't flinch. He didn't have time to. Hell's Wench began dropping in altitude as the fire chewed its way outward, and the entire bomber shook with each burst of flak slamming into its frame. The bombardier, Lieutenant Hoyt, yelled over the interphone that he had the aiming point, one of the critical cracking towers the mission planners had marked as essential. The plane was dying beneath them, but as long as they were still flying, Baker was going to give Hoyt a stable run. He leveled the burning plane at barely 60 feet altitude, flames trailing behind them like a comet tail. The gunners were firing non-stop, tracing arcs of brass out of the hatches, but the enemy defenses were too dense to suppress. More shells punched through the fuselage. An explosion ripped open the waist section, and fragments tore through the flight deck, but Baker kept the bomber straight, steady, and low. At the precise moment Hoyt released the bombs, Hell's Wench lurched violently, struck by another direct burst under the cockpit. The blast shattered the control column and ripped away hydraulic lines, and the fire on the wing surged brighter, almost white. But Baker held the plane on target long enough for the payload to fall true. Below them, the refinery erupted, first in controlled charges, then in expanding spheres of fire as pipelines and storage vats ignited. Tower after tower collapsed in chains of explosions that roared through the complex like a storm. Hoyt shouted confirmation. They had smashed one of the vital production nodes. They had done their part. But the cost was immediate. The right wing now looked half-melted, burning so intensely that charred pieces were peeling away in the slipstream. The bomber banked sharply as structural integrity failed, dropping dangerously toward the refinery. Baker's co-pilot shouted that they had to bail out, but Baker knew the truth. The plane was too low, too fast, too unstable. If they tried to jump, most of the crew would die before their chutes even opened. So he fought the control wheel with both hands, guiding Hell's Wench through the rising heat columns, trying to gain just 20 more feet of altitude, anything to get his men clear. The crew could hear the flames consuming the aircraft, could feel the heat radiating through metal panels that were turning red. Hell's Wench had delivered her strike, but she was a dead aircraft, still flying, held aloft only by Baker's will and the last scraps of lift clinging to her burning wings. And everyone on board knew it.
The moment Hell's Wench crossed the refinery perimeter, the sky behind the formation erupted as though the earth itself had chosen that exact second to detonate. Baker heard the concussive booms before he saw the blossoms of fire, thick, oily bursts of black and orange that swallowed entire aircraft in a heartbeat. The formation, already shredded by the initial barrage, began to disintegrate as damaged Liberators tried desperately to stay airborne. Baker watched one B-24 to his right roll painfully onto its wing, its engines coughing smoke before the fuselage snapped in half mid-air. The crew didn't stand a chance. Another aircraft, closer this time, took a direct hit to its bomb bay. A blinding flash consumed it, followed by the eerie sight of burning fragments spiraling downward like fiery confetti. Amid the chaos, Baker felt every instinct screaming to climb, to bank, to break formation, anything to escape this steel hurricane, but discipline kept him glued to the plan. Even as his controls rattled violently and the airframe groaned under the stress of shock waves, he held steady, guiding the remnants of his group through the gauntlet. He knew that breaking formation meant dying alone and dying fast. But leaving the kill zone proved even more perilous than entering it. The German and Romanian gunners, furious at the damage inflicted on their prized refineries, raked the now scattered Liberators with renewed determination. Tracers, thin, incandescent lines, reached up from every direction, forcing Baker to weave just enough to spoil the enemy's aim without losing what was left of structural control. Behind him, a plume of smoke trailed from the right wing. A near miss had sheared off part of the aileron, making the aircraft sluggish and unpredictable. The intercom crackled with voices, some calm, some panicked, some abruptly cut short as shells found their marks. Baker glanced back through the cockpit window and saw several B-24s limping behind the formation, engines sputtering, wings perforated, glass turrets hanging by twisted metal. He knew many of them wouldn't make it home. Yet as the flak finally began to thin and the burning sprawl of Ploiești fell behind them, a fragile sense of survival took hold inside him. They were bloodied, damaged, and scattered, but alive. Baker tightened his grip on the controls, steadying the wounded aircraft as he pointed the nose toward the long, uncertain flight back to friendly lines. The worst was behind them, but the mission was far from over. The moment the surviving Liberators cleared the densest wall of flak over Ploiești, the formation disintegrated into scattered, wounded fragments. Captain Baker's Hell's Wench was barely holding together, one engine coughing smoke in uneven bursts, another running hot enough to blister the cowling, the control cables stiff as if soaked in cement. The aircraft vibrated with each gust of wind, every shudder making the crew brace for the sound of shearing metal. Inside, the smell of burned hydraulic fluid with cordite hung thick in the air. The radio operator struggled to raise anyone. Static answered him, broken only by distant, panicked fragments of call signs that hinted at the chaos unfolding across the sky. Through the cockpit windows, Baker saw isolated shapes, single B-24s limping alone, some trailing fire, others descending in slow, fatal spirals.
Enemy fighters occasionally darted in, taking advantage of the chaos to pick off stragglers. Baker maneuvered with excruciating care. Too sharp a turn could tear off a weakened wing panel, yet too gentle a move meant presenting an easy target. Below them, Romania's fields drifted in dreamlike silence, a stark contrast to the inferno they had just escaped. As the minutes dragged on, the full cost of the mission began to reveal itself. Turret gunners reported wounded comrades across the few aircraft they could still see. One Liberator spewed fuel in a long, shimmering arc. Another shed pieces of fuselage with every vibration. Inside Hell's Wench, the crew worked frantically to keep the bomber alive, patching ruptured lines with emergency kits, stamping out reigniting flames near the bomb bay, and tending to the bleeding waist gunner who had taken shrapnel minutes before the drop. The aircraft groaned like a living thing in agony, but it stayed aloft, defying the physics that should have already claimed it. Baker knew they were flying on borrowed time. Fuel gauges hovered ominously low, the engine's rhythms were uneven and unpredictable, and the once disciplined formation was reduced to a desperate migration of individual survivors. Every mile gained felt stolen from fate, every moment of level flight a small miracle. Yet despite the mounting failures, Hell's Wench continued to crawl across the sky, its crew driven by equal parts discipline and sheer refusal to let the bomber die before they were clear of enemy territory.
As the battered bomber cleared the final stretch of open sky, the cruel truth settled like ice in the stomach of every man aboard. There would be no safe landing. Fuel gauges hovered empty, engines vibrated with a warning growl, and every shudder of the fuselage felt like the heartbeat of a dying creature. Captain Baker's eyes swept over the crew one last time, reading fear, exhaustion, and grim determination etched into their faces. The weight of the decision pressed down on him with a tangible force. There was no time to hesitate. He barked the order to abandon ship, his voice cutting through the roar of failing engines and the whistle of wind, and watched as men scrambled toward the hatches, parachutes snapping open in the frigid air. He remained at the controls, shoulder to shoulder with the navigator, steering the shuddering, smoke-choked Hell's Wench on a straight, unwavering course. Every pull on the yoke was an act of defiance against gravity, fire, and metal fatigue. Each adjustment a prayer that the aircraft could hold together long enough for his men to escape the inferno of the doomed bomber. Outside, the world seemed suspended in slow motion. Parachutes blossoming against the twilight, twisted remnants of the formation falling like petals, and the faint glimmer of Romanian fields rushing past below, silent witnesses to the final act of sacrifice.